Hello, and welcome to Irish Opera Podcast. This podcast is made possible by Blueberry.com. If you're thinking of starting your own podcast, get your first month of hosting for free by using the offer code Irish Opera. That's capital I, capital O, no space, Irish Opera for your first month for free. If you'd like to help this podcast grow, you can subscribe to us on patreon.com/Irish Opera Podcast or email us at irishoperapodcast@gmail.com to make a one-time PayPal donation. This episode is going out a little later than expected because I was down in Lismore and couldn't actually get it to upload. But I dare not mention the woes of rural broadband at the moment. We've enough of that in the press. Today we'll be talking to Una Hunt, who has been a champion of Irish composers for many, many years. And we'll be talking about two of her projects that are upcoming. One at the Manannan International Festival of Music, which is Balfe's The Sleeping Queen. And the second will take place as part of Wexford Festival this year. And that's The Veiled Prophet by Stanford. But before we cut to that, I'd like to give you a few dates for the diary. Tom Lane's new opera, The Stalls, is on in Cork Opera House at the moment from the 12th of June to the 14th of June. And Northern Ireland Opera will be giving several presentations of The Chronic Identity Crisis of Pamplemousse, a new children's opera by Greg Caffrey. And that will tour through Belfast, Newry, Enniskillen, Omagh, Armagh and Derry between the 16th of June and the 22nd of June. You can also catch The Sleeping Queen at the Manannan International Festival of Music on the 21st of June. And if you have any questions after this episode for us, do tweet us or message us on Facebook or email us any of those. We will have Una back on before the end of the summer. So if you have any follow-up questions, now would be the time to send those in. But without further delay, let's cut to Una. Hi Una, how are you?
Good, thanks, Kevin. How are you?
I'm not too bad. So first and foremost, you're a pianist, and many people will know you from your work with your sister Fionnuala, both in concert and on CDs. How did you catch the bug for researching Irish composers as a concert pianist?
Well, to be honest, I was always interested in Irish composers. I remember asking my teachers when I was a kid, why do we never play any Irish composers? And I remember hearing back, oh, well, they're probably not very good. Or, there are no Irish composers. And of course, I believed that like everybody else. Nobody seemed to know anything about Irish composers. But then I started to realise, hang on a minute, there's lots and lots of Irish composers. We just don't know anything about them.
Yeah.
So it's always been something of interest to me. I've always wanted to play the music of my own country the way everybody else does. And why is Ireland the only country in the world where this doesn't happen? I've always thought that was strange. Well, I started life in a sort of a musical family. My mother was an opera singer and she was a piano teacher as well. And we all, myself and my siblings, all played every instrument you could imagine. There were cellos, flutes, oboes, harp. I played the harp at one stage, violins, you name it. It was like a little mini orchestra. Mm-hmm. And we all played together. And funny enough, about Irish composers, I remember we had two pianos in one room. Yeah. And the music of Joan Trimble, who did a lot of two-piano duos with her sister, she wrote the music for those duos. She was an Enniskillen composer. And that used to sit on our pianos at home, and I used to play it and get my brother to play the other part with me and things like this. And I always loved it. I always loved that sort of, it isn't actually Irish tunes or Irish airs that she's using in her music, but it has that feeling of Irishness, which I always find very attractive.
Like the modal kind of thing you were talking about actually yesterday when we were coming down in the car, that like there was to the Ethna by Robert O'Dwyer, that it doesn't necessarily have Irish tunes in it, but it takes that modal kind of sound and incorporates it into the construction of it.
Yeah, and actually talking about that, I think there's relatively few composers who can do that very, very successfully. Yeah. I think Joan Trimble's one of them, and I think Robert O'Dwyer's probably another. Because you often hear sort of very twee stuff, and you sort of say, "Oh no, I couldn't play that." Yeah, really don't like that so much. But Yeah, I think it's a special skill actually.
Yeah.
To have that sort of faintly Irish feeling to a piece of music that is not actually an Irish air, but to be able to incorporate that in such a way that it's tasteful, I suppose.
Yeah. We spoke to Gavin Ring recently, and it seems a lot came out of the Gems of Irish Opera concerts back in 2008. How did that concert come about?
Well, I was doing concerts. Well, first of all, I went into the National Library as their music consultant. I actually went into the National Library around 1998 to the director, and I said, I want to set up an archive of Irish composers in here in the National Library. And he was looking at me as if I had come out of Mars or something. But he said, I want you to do a survey of our music here in the library, first of all, before we go ahead and do something like that. And I was looking at him and thinking, well, there is no music in here. What music would be in the National Library, you know?
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe the stuff that I found. I got so into it, actually. I got really, really interested in it. And I mean, I was looking at all these composers and names I'd never heard of. And of course, I was saying to myself, well, you know, who the hell are these people? And then bit by bit, it began to dawn on me, these are Irish composers, but we just don't know anything about them, you know. So that started a really important journey for me, I think, because I went on and did a PhD out of that, out of some of the music that I found in the library.
Yeah.
George Alexander Osborne, who was a pianist composer from Limerick, and there were 7 or 8 pieces, your hometown, and there were 7 or 8 pieces of his music in the National Library. And when I went and looked in the British Library, there were 400 of them.
Yeah.
And I thought, hang on here a minute, and nobody's ever heard of him, let alone played his music, you know. But it turns out he was quite an important figure. But I think, like so many other Irish composers, they were considered to be sort of provincial, you know, at a time when Ireland was still part of the British Empire, if you like. And they were considered provincial composers, and the musical intelligentsia in London tended to shun them. I think it was very, very difficult for those composers to get on if they were Irish, you know, especially someone like Osborne, who apparently spoke with a brogue his entire life. Oh, right. So he wasn't trying to look like an English composer, if you know what I mean. Which is what you sort of had to do to be successful in the 19th century. Anyway, to get on to, you know, your question about the Gems of Irish Opera concerts. Well, anyway, I did that survey, and then I went on, I did the PhD, and the library retained me as a consultant, and I used to do concerts on the music collections in the National Library. In the library itself, you know, always a huge amount of interest in it, I must say. But then in 2008, it was Balfe's bicentenary.
Yeah.
Michael William Balfe, our Irish opera composer. And so I had already got the score of The Sleeping Queen, basically, from Basil Walsh in America. He'd sent it to me a few years previous to this. So, you know, I thought, well, this is something that's very doable. Unlike most opera, which costs an arm and a leg, and you know, it's a huge undertaking. This little operetta was just with piano and 4 characters, and it was written for piano, not for orchestra. So in a way, you weren't altering it at all by doing it that way. So I did that as part of the Gems of Irish Opera. And then the other thing I did was excerpts from 3 other Irish sort of key composers. One of them was Robert O'Dwyer's Ethna. Then we did excerpts from The Amber Witch by Wallace, William Vincent Wallace. And then, as I said, the Balfe one. And then finally, The Veiled Prophet of Khorasan by Stanford. And it's kind of interesting the way all of those, okay, that's 11 years ago now when I think about it. But all of those works are bit by bit, they have come out now and they're getting performances, which is, at the time it seemed like an impossibility. When I talked to other people that were enthusiastic about this, they sort of, oh, well, it's so difficult and nobody wants to hear music by Irish composers. And that I don't quite understand, because anytime I present music by Irish composers in concerts, the audience is always very enthusiastic about it,
Yeah.
And certainly the radio broadcasts I've done as well, and the documentaries and features that I've done on Irish composers, they get an amazing reaction. you know. So there's just something wrong with Ireland. I can't really work it out why it is that we're so apologetic, I think, about our composers, and sort of there's a lethargy about actually approaching what is actually very exciting, very exciting project,
Balfe wrote 28 operas in total. Do you think any will be revisited in the future? Is there any in particular that you have an interest in? Is there any scores that you found that you think would be particularly good or available in terms of being able to reconstruct them? Or
well, that's another problem we have with opera in particular, that there's always problems with the scores.
Yeah.
And especially when they have not been done for over 100 years or something like that. The likelihood of you finding the orchestral sets and the orchestral parts is probably, it's probably not good. And until you have a set of orchestral parts and a conductor's score, you can't even start to think about it.
Yeah.
So I did the scoping report for the Arts Council about 3 years ago, on 4 key Irish operas, which I knew had not been done and which I thought, were worthy of doing. And that, again, I think that was a very useful thing to do, because out of that came the project for Wexford this year, for The Veiled Prophet by Stanford, because we were able to ascertain that there were no orchestral sets still extant. So we knew that the whole score had to be reconstructed. So then we had to set about working out how to fund that, basically, and find the right person to do it as well. But Jeremy Dibble, who's Professor of Music in Durham University, he's reconstructed the score. He's just finished it, actually. It's very exciting. And he just sent it to me the other day. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but that's, the thing about that is it's just so exciting to think that you're going to hear this score.
Yeah.
Because there's no doubt about it, Stanford was a really good orchestrator. I mean, he could write for the orchestra very well. He taught so many famous composers himself, So, I mean, this was something...
Vaughan Williams and
others. I mean, all the sort of rising composers in England at the beginning of the 20th century.
Was he quite different to Osborne?
Stanford.
Where Stanford kind of is very often even mistaken for being English because of all of his association with the English church.
Indeed. And I remember reading in an old Groves Dictionary of Music that Stanford was an English composer of Irish birth, which I thought was a very strange thing to say altogether, So in other words, what is he?
Yeah.
But I think in the latest Groves, you don't see that. I mean, I think he's acknowledged as an Irish composer. But the thing about Stanford was that he was able to join the establishment in England. Yeah. He was accepted in a way that Osborne and many of the other composers were not.
Okay.
Who were considered to be just sort of, they were Irish, just sort of bogmen, I suppose, provincial kind of thing. Because Stanford, number one, he was professor in Cambridge. He was professor of composition in the Royal College of Music when it opened. He was appointed the professor. He was very much establishment. And as you say, the fact that he wrote so much music for choral music for the Anglican Church means that, and it's still done, I believe, it's very much still there at the forefront. So,
well, I think of the composers' names that we're talking about today, like Stanford, Osborne, Balfe, all these names that we're talking about, the most recognizable is most certainly Stanford, even in terms of songwriting. You know, anyone who, we were talking about Feis Ceoil on the last podcast, and you know, anyone who goes into Feis knows a Stanford song. You know, he's very familiar to everyone, I think. Whereas I think Balfe and Osborne and people like that, you wouldn't necessarily know instantly any of their music.
No. And you see, I think as well, the fact that, well, Stanford was very prolific. I mean, if you look at the amount of music that he wrote a huge amount of music. That helps for a start. And he wrote in every genre. He wrote chamber music, he wrote violin sonatas, trios, you name it, quartets. He wrote orchestral music, he wrote symphonies, etc. Yeah. He wrote operas, which I think is a revelation because nobody, I mean, a few years ago, nobody even knew that Stanford had written operas.
Yeah.
But he has 9 or 10 operas, you know. So that was obviously something he took quite seriously. And I went to an opera that was produced last year in the Cadogan Hall in London. Mm-hmm. And it was called The Travelling Companion, which was Stanford's last
opera, wasn't it?
It was his last opera.
Yeah. The Sussex Opera Company, I think, put it on.
New Sussex Opera Company. And it was really amazing to hear that, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I would say that Stanford has a very unique voice, actually. Mm-hmm. I don't think he sounded that much like anybody else, you know.
Yeah.
And I thought the story was really neat. It was taken from one of these Grimm's fairy tales, or Hans Christian Andersen, can't remember which. But the story was really good.
Yeah.
And it worked out really well, you know. And sometimes stories and operas can be very, very poor altogether. I remember.
Well, we were just talking about how convoluted The Magic Flute was recently. And, you know, it is like, I mean, it's great music and it's a great opera, but the story, sometimes you kind of look at it and you go, what?
I know. And I remember being in Wexford last year at one of the operas, and the story was so convoluted that halfway through the second act, the whole audience started to laugh. You know, because you were looking in disbelief at the surtitles and saying, "Oh no, that can't be," you know, and then you wonder, is that part of the reason why the opera is unknown? You know,
I mean, people are like, "This makes no sense. Why would we do this again?"
I know, and you know,
even if the music is great.
That's the thing. You see, probably a composer like Mozart can get away with a kind of a mad story, you know. Because he's just such a great composer anyway.
Yeah.
But then I think these are factors in the reason why operas don't last, or, you know, they go out of fashion.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that, you know, Stanford was very prolific, but in terms of opera, Balfe was one of the most popular composers of operas in the English language for a very long time. And a lot of us would know the Bohemian Girl, at least have heard of it, probably never seen it because it's not done very much at all anymore, I don't think. No. But why do you think that Balfe slid into obscurity in a way that Stanford didn't, when actually during his time he was, you know, very prolific in terms of opera?
Well, I think Stanford, in terms of his operas, slid into obscurity too. Yeah. I think this movement, I mean, Balfe was at the forefront of the movement to establish English language opera in the 19th century. And he was certainly probably the main man. Wallace was another one who did very well. And, you know, there weren't many. They were dogged with problems in terms of financing their operas. The operas were pulled so many times before the premieres because they just didn't have the money to put them on. The audiences wanted Italian opera.
Yeah.
That was what everybody wanted to go to see. And in those days, even Covent Garden was called the Royal Italian Opera.
Yeah.
And everything they put on in Covent Garden was in Italian.
And The Veiled Prophet, I think, was put on in Italian in Covent Garden, wasn't it? Yeah. So it never had an English language premiere in his lifetime, yet at the same time, that was the original language it was written in.
Yeah, I know. It's so bizarre.
It is.
It's crazy, bizarre. But to get back to Balfe, I think there were a lot of problems for those composers. I think they were all the time trying to chase the money to try and get their works on stage. I think a lot of the time maybe their libretti weren't the best. There was a lot of old-fashioned language used in the libretto. That was the fashion at the time.
Yeah.
But they also had to go to people like Alfred Bunn, and these were the managers of the theatres,
yes,
where they wanted to get the operas put on.
Yeah.
So therefore, if you asked the manager of the theatre to write your libretto, then you had a good chance of getting it done.
Yes.
I mean, it makes sense.
It does, yeah.
So, there's all this sort of political kind of shenanigans going on with the small p, obviously,
yeah.
that helped you get your opera on stage. But ultimately, that movement to establish English language opera failed.
Yeah.
In England. I mean, it wasn't until you were well into the 20th century and people like Britten and Tippett came along, that, it was actually recognised as a form of opera.
Yeah.
Because before that, it just wasn't happening for it. And I think also that people like Balfe fell between two stools. You see, Balfe had this amazing career as a baritone. Sang all over Italy and France, and he sang with some of the greatest singers of the time. There were roles created for him. He was a serious opera singer.
Yeah.
And then he goes and starts writing opera. But I think for Balfe, the problem for him was that he wanted to write in the Italianate style.
Yeah.
And he did write in the Italianate style to a certain degree. But the sort of latter-day ballad opera was what was popular in England at the time. So it was kind of a lowbrow type of opera. That's what people wanted to hear. It was either that or they wanted to hear Italian opera.
Yeah.
There was nothing in between.
Yeah.
And in a way, Balfe was trying to create this hybrid, which was better music than the ballad opera. And he also would have preferred not to have so much dialogue in his operas, but that was what was required. And I mean, when you look at it, this famous Irish ring, as they call it.
Yes.
Which is Wallace's Maritana, Balfe's Bohemian Girl, and then a piece called The Lily of Killarney by Julius Benedict, who was a German composer. But anyway, that was part of the Irish ring. And
something about the story tied in or something, isn't it?
Yes, but it's also the way those operas are written. Certainly the Wallace and the Balfe. If you look at Wallace and those two operas, and they were the two most famous operas for both those composers, Maritana and the Bohemian Girl. They are written in a sort of a hybrid ballad opera style.
Yeah.
And that was very, very popular. That was guaranteed to be popular. And it was on both sides of the Atlantic. It went everywhere. Those operas were done everywhere. But when Balfe went and wrote his Falstaff, for instance, which was recorded in 2008, and that was an Italian language opera, it was written for one of the greatest singers of the era, a guy called Lablache.
Yeah.
And that was not successful when it was first done, even though Balfe thought it was his best opera.
Yeah.
So you had this problem all the time that Balfe wanted to write better operas, if you like, but they weren't successful.
Right, okay. Looking at The Sleeping Queen, that is a operetta, and it's very small scale, so it is very possible to put on a budget. Why was that done in that way? Because it's very apart, I think, from the rest of his repertoire, isn't it? Because he wrote 28 operas, but only the one operetta.
That's right. And then you wonder why, even though lots of people would call The Bohemian Girl an operetta too. I mean, sometimes you just call an opera an operetta because there's dialogue in it. Do you know what I mean? I'm not quite sure what they considered to be an operetta in those days. I think it was vague enough,
Yeah.
But in terms of, I think of the Sleeping Queen as a chamber opera, really.
Yeah.
because as you say, it's the 4 characters and the piano, and that's the whole thing. And of course, it was done in a tiny little venue in London, in Regent Street in London, which was called the Gallery of Illustrations. And in this little venue, there wouldn't have been room for an orchestra anyway. So there were various operas written specifically for this venue, and this was one of the operas written for this. And I think when I started the process of trying to get it on stage, I never really thought that it would turn out to be so important as a work, you know, because I really do think that it was very influential. I think certainly that Gilbert and Sullivan, who were formed at that Gallery of Illustration, their partnership was formed there too, but at a much later stage after Balfe had done that little operetta. But when you hear the operetta, it just sounds exactly like Gilbert and Sullivan.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, like, when I first heard it, that's where my mind went straight away, and I said it to you, and you were like, well, actually, this came first.
Exactly. So did Arthur Sullivan take his style, and indeed Gilbert, you know, even the style of the libretto is very like Gilbert and Sullivan. So were they taking, you know, they were at least inspired, were they, by Balfe? I think they probably were.
Absolutely, because, I mean, the story of the Sleeping Queen is totally farcical. I mean, you know, there's a very pompous regent in it who's, you know, very mocking of the aristocracy, because, I mean, you can't take him seriously. And then, you know, we see that throughout Gilbert and Sullivan. Like, I mean, there's a huge amount of pomposity in all of their works. But Gilbert and Sullivan is still so popular today, and there's societies all over the UK. There's societies in Ireland that are still doing Gilbert and Sullivan. But we're not doing Balfe. Why are we not doing our own composer who's so similar? Why do you think that he slipped and they seem to manage to keep everything going?
Well, I think once Gilbert and Sullivan established themselves, I think it was blanket Gilbert and Sullivan. I mean, they were just so successful that nobody else could sort of, you know, weigh in there at all.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think when that happens, I think they sort of push everything else out of the frame.
Yeah.
So people like Balfe, probably after he died, became, you know, just forgotten about.
Yeah.
I think. Now, having said that,
and I think Arthur Sullivan did actually say himself at one stage that, you know, they were influenced by Balfe.
Yes.
Didn't?
Yes, yeah. I'm sure he did. And I know he did recognise that.
Yeah.
But I just think that influence was much greater than any of us would have ever thought before, you know? And yet, I mean, James Joyce has him all over the place. It's certainly in the beginning of the 20th century. I don't know so much in England, but certainly in Ireland.
Yeah.
Balfe and Wallace was done a lot. I mean, right up into the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah.
You know, they were still popular.
But we've lost the
But we've lost it now. We've lost it now, yeah. The thing is about the scores, most of the operas can be reconstructed. It is possible to do it. But it costs money and it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But I think it's kind of worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
To bring them back onto the stage.
Yeah, it's part of our past, part of
and
our heritage.
And absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So Wexford is well known for staging works that are rarely performed. Do you know, have they unearthed any other Irish operas over the years? Or is The Veiled Prophet one of their first?
Well, if you look back into Wexford in the 1950s, they actually did Balfe operas. Okay. They certainly did The Rose of Castile, which is a great opera actually of Balfe's, you know, and should be done again. And they did another one as well, I think. I can't remember which one, but they were done in the very early years of the Wexford Festival. Yeah, Balfe's operas were done, and then they just sort of went out the door with the dodo. I think with all this kind of music, I realise this very much, that if you don't have a champion, if a composer doesn't have a champion, who is prepared to really get out there and shout it from the heights, you know, about this person, then it's very likely that they get forgotten about, you know?
Yeah. What is the Veiled Prophet about?
Okay, well, the first interesting thing about The Veiled Prophet is that it's based on part of an Oriental romance by Thomas Moore called Lalla Rookh. This was published in 1817. It was, apart from Moore's Irish Melodies, it was the most famous and successful thing that he wrote. And it's a sort of a long poem, but there's prose in it as well, but there's various parts to the story. And it's sort of based on this princess called, what is her, Tulip Cheek or something is her name. But she's basically on her way to get married to a prince, an Arabian prince of some description. But she has someone playing a lute and singing her songs and telling her stories. There's a servant there. And guess what? She falls in love with him.
Yeah.
And, his stories and all the rest of it. I think, in a way, this is autobiographical. I think this is Moore kind of writing himself into the story as well. The poet who woos the princess kind of thing. So this particular part of the story is very dark, in fact. The Veiled Prophet keeps on telling his followers that he has a veil because they couldn't look on his face because he's so beautiful, and they would just die if they saw him, really. But actually, he's a bit of a hunchback of Notre Dame.
Yeah.
He has a very ugly face. He's very deformed and all the rest. But that's the reason why he wears the veil. But he manipulates his followers in such a way that eventually they kill themselves because he tells them to do so. And of course, to me, there's very modern resonances of these sort of cults in America and all from this type of a story. Do you know?
Yeah.
Because right at the end, they all kill themselves. And basically, Azim, who is the tenor role, and the soprano role, who is
Sinead Campbell-Wallace?
She is Sinead Campbell-Wallace, but she's singing the role of Zelika.
Okay.
So it's Zelika and Azim. They eventually sort of understand that the prophet is a monster, even though all his followers are completely kind of, won over and indoctrinated exactly by him. And then they go to unveil him, basically. But he kills himself at the end too, the Veiled Prophet. It's all quite dark, and it's a very strange story, but very dramatic, I would think.
Yeah. But this is going to be a concert version for this particular performance. Would you have hopes for it to go on beyond this, or are there anything in mind at the moment that it may go somewhere?
I'd love to think it would be done on stage in Ireland, but I think it's very unlikely. Once it's been done in a concert performance, I think it's very hard to get an audience to come back for a stage performance. Sad as that may be, I'm sure it's going to be done somewhere. If it's done in America or in England, I think it will be done somewhere.
And I mean, now that the score is going to be available, once this performance takes place, it'll have been reconstructed. It's available for other people to take up the mantle and maybe actually do a fully staged version of it. And similarly to Ethna, which, got its concert performance a year and a half ago or 2 years ago or something like that. But, again, didn't get a full production. And I mean, is it a really large production to put on? Because Ethna was huge. There were so many characters. There's a huge chorus required to make it work. How does Stanford compare? Is that big as well? Because I mean, Stanford is famous for all of his choral music. So I can only imagine, if we look at O'Dwyer and how much he integrated the chorus into the story, like, I can only imagine Stanford is pretty similar in that he probably demands quite a lot of them.
Absolutely. The chorus is huge in The Veiled Prophet. In fact, I would say, as a character, the chorus is the biggest part of the opera.
Yeah.
So there's a chorus going to go from TU Dublin Conservatory to join the main chorus in Wexford. The chorus will be about 50 to 60 strong, well over 50 anyway. It's a big,
that's big.
It's a good chorus.
I mean, that's a Aida or Turandot type of chorus.
Absolutely.
You know, that's big.
But it is a grand opera in the big romantic style. You know, there's a big orchestra. I mean, it's at least a medium to large size orchestra. There's not so many soloists per se. I think it's about 7 or 8 solo characters, probably less than what Ethna had.
Yeah.
But certainly the chorus is a huge part of it. And I thought it was very interesting when I saw The Travelling Companion in London that time too. That was his last opera. The chorus in that was a huge part too.
Yeah.
It was almost like it was making commentary the whole way through. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? So you couldn't have done the opera without the chorus. And I have a sneaking suspicion you couldn't do The Veiled Prophet without the chorus either.
Yeah. And in the Ethna, they definitely drove a lot of the story, and, you know, the people were a huge part of it. And I think I remember reading something about at the time, you know, the kind of political climate and social climate, you know, it was very much a day for the people to have their say. So, you know, O'Dwyer and Stanford really were able to kind of make use of that because, I mean, they were so good at writing chorus music.
Exactly. Yeah. And I do remember the Ethna chorus. I was there at the performance, and I remember being very impressed with it. You could see that this was such a huge part of the whole drama and everything.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for doing this. It was lovely to chat to you.
Great to talk to you too, Kevin. Indeed. At the Sleeping Queen.
At the Sleeping Queen. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. It would also be really helpful if you could rate and review us on your favourite podcasting platform. That helps us get out to a wider audience. And don't forget to send us in any questions you might have for Una, because we will have her back again. All right, talk to you soon. Slán.